I am. I know different time zones all over the world here today, so kind of interesting. And we're going to discuss a test that we're really very excited about at Genova. I know that in speaking to Kimberly, and I assume you have my screen up or yours there, Kimberly?
So I have, let me see. I have my screen, but it's not up. I'm not entirely sure. Let me
Do you
try to.
want to hand me the ability to move the screen, and I think that might be a good idea.
Yes, absolutely. This is a little bit new format. So normally,
I know. Just when I got used to the old format, they changed it.
I know, I'm trying to see. Normally it's like past the screen. Um,
Right.
do you have
Maybe if
this?
you just right click on my name or something.
Yeah, let's see if I can make presenter. Here we go, Dr. Goldman, coming your way.
All right, let's see. Yep. Share. And okay, I think you all are seeing my screen now. I see some of your faces out there. Good morning, afternoon. I'm Steve Goldman, DC. I'm part of the medical education team at Genova Diagnostics. And it's great to be able to speak with you all today. I've been at Genova a good long while. I think I'm about to begin my 14th year. I'm hoping you all hear me okay. And we're going to talk about a test today that we're very excited about. Now, I know all of you have different experiences or background with the lab testing through Genova. Some of you, if you're familiar with Genova testing, may be aware that we have a test. Over the years, we've had a test called the Optimal Nutritional Evaluation. And the thing we loved about it was all first morning void and provided a real wide variety of testing. It was a first morning void for organic acids, for amino acids, for a couple of oxidative stress markers that we'll look at, and provided recommendations on many different nutrient needs, as well as mitochondrial function and gut function. So there was a lot about the one that was wonderful because it was so easy for a patient to provide a specimen at home, a first morning void. We have ended the one because we have now changed it into a test called Metabolomix Plus. And the Metabolomix Plus is the one test as it was, and we'll go through that first. The organic acids, the amino acids, as well as some oxidative stress markers. The plus portion provides more opportunity to get more data, a wider data pool. It's going to include the option, it's up to the physician, to do a comprehensive urine elements profile or toxic elements profile in urine. It affords the opportunity through blood spot, to do an essential metabolic fatty acids test. It also provides the opportunity to do some testing of single nucleotide polymorphisms, 4 of them to be exact, which is a buccal collection. So the thing that we love about this test is we've really widened the database when we change from the 1 profile to the Metabolomix Plus, with all these various options depending on what the physician really wants in terms of their data. But the other aspect of it is that you can do it from home. You don't need a phlebotomist. It's literally first morning void, possibly a blood spot, and a buccal specimen for the DNA for the SNP, the single nucleotide polymorphism. And so it really produces a wide range of data, and it's something that the patient can do very easily at home. So if you look at the screen, what I have up right now is actually the homepage for Genova Diagnostics. And I just wanted to kind of tool around it a little bit so that you could find where things are, because we have a lot online. And before I forget, I also want to point out that you can go where you get your podcast. And my colleagues, Dr. Michael Chapman and Dr. Patty Devers, have a podcast called The Lab Report. And they did a whole segment on this test, the Metabolomix Plus. So if you go to the podcast and look at it, they even have someone from the lab going through the technology that was used for the different sections of the test if you want to investigate that further. So I highly recommend the lab report. with my colleagues as a great resource. Now, what you're looking at here right now is the homepage for Genova Diagnostics. I just wanted you to get a sense of where we go here. You have this option here for clinicians on the top, and if you hit that, there's a wide range of options. So you can look up various tests and search them, but also we have here medical education. So we have conferences, we have GDX webinars. We do webinars once a month on different topics, and we record those. So there's a long list of recorded webinars on different topics of Genova testing from physicians that do it. It's an hour long, usually about 50 minutes and 10 to 15 minutes of a Q&A. So you might find that interesting. Now, I go to search test A to Z, and if all goes well, I get to test profiles alphabetized. So this is how you can search for any test. So we're going to be looking at the Metabolomix Plus page. So I'm hitting the M, and here we have all the various tests. There's the Metabolomix Plus option. I hit this, and this is going to take me here to the page that has the information on the Metabolomix Plus. So in other words, you don't have to do a lot of writing here because a lot of it is really laid out in terms of the fact that it's a functional nutritional assessment, what that means, various types of patients that might really benefit from the test, mood disorders, mitochondrial dysfunction, fatigue, chronic stress, and inflammation. And then the various aspects of the test, the organic acids and their subsets, the amino acids, again, organic acids, first morning void, amino acids, first morning void, ox stress markers, which we'll talk about, the 8-hydroxy-deoxyguanosine and lipid peroxide. And then this is one of the pluses, which I think is fantastic, because you don't need a phlebotomist for this, a blood spot that they can choose that have all these, omega-3, 6, 9, saturated fats, all of these. And then also a urine test for toxics and nutrients, if you choose it. And then the genomics, these SNPs, the apolipoprotein E, MTHFR, Tnf Alpha, and COMT. And we'll talk about all of these, but it's all laid out here for you. And if you have specific questions as to what was the technology that was utilized, they lay it out here for you so you can really dig into that. And again, on the podcast that I mentioned, the lab report, we have someone from the lab actually talking through what some of these things are and how they're done. So you can really get firmly aware of all that. I like talking more about the tests themselves, but the other aspect to this that you should be aware of, on the right side, the additional resources, which has collection instructions. How do you collect for each part? And this is something that comes with the kit so that they know how to collect. Sample reports, and we're going to look at the sample report today. That's what we're going to go over. Patient brochures. Under additional information, there is a metabolic analysis profile, a support guide for the test, for the portion of the amino acids, organic acids. And then also, Learn GDX gets you to some of the learning modules that we have on our testing. And then test prep, which is, I think, really a great thing to be aware of when you're talking to doctors. Test prep is answering questions such as, well, I have a patient on this medication. Is that going to be a problem? Or when I collect, is it a problem if I don't do it for 10 hours, if I do it for 8 hours? Whatever the questions may be about preparing for the test that we see coming up all the time over the phone are all listed here under test prep. So it's a great idea to familiarize yourself with this and make sure the doctors are aware of this option, because so many of their questions are answered in that section. So I'm going to go to sample report. So this is what the test looks like, the Metabolomix Plus. As I said, the first section, all first morning void. Now, when I look at a test like this that has a lot of different markers, I'm going to want to really look for patterns. And that's really the key, I think, for a test like this. And when I look at the front page, the findings here, these are the recommendations based on the analytes of the test, but really based on specifically the amino acids, the organic acids, and the ox stress markers. if they add on the blood spot essential metabolic fatty acids, then they also get a report that would be included in the omega-3 recommendation as part of the algorithm as well. But otherwise, all of these are based on the first section, the one that used to be the one that is now the Metabolomix. And so if you look at this, we lay it out so that you have these sections: antioxidants, B vitamins, and minerals. And within that, we have the normal green. And what we mean by normal is that when the algorithm looked through the analytes regarding vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin E, that it found that the findings looked really rather good. And so green recommendations will have on the next page dose recommendations, but they're the minimum of what we would think to provide. The borderline yellow, I think of more as borderline to moderate need. So in this case, you see all those B vitamins and magnesium indicating a borderline need. And then the high need in red, and you see the alpha lipoic acid, where we actually in the high need, right here, what our recommendation is. And what I do is I step back and I go, okay, so what are the headlines here? Okay, well, I think really the biggest headline is that there are so many moderate recommendations around B vitamins. Okay, and secondarily, that there's a high need for alpha lipoic acid and a moderate need for magnesium. So those are highlights to me. And remember, this is, excuse me, this is a functional recommendation. So in other words, when we say there's a need for B12 cobalamin that's moderate, there's not a direct blood draw and a measurement of B12. That would be a direct measurement. What that means is that there are a number of different findings on the test, different analytes on the test that require B12 as a cofactor. And that if the algorithm looks at those and sees that there's a need, it will make a recommendation for B12. And that's what we mean by a functional recommendation. It's not a direct measure. There is recommendations based on findings, but well, on the NutriVal, for example, some direct findings from blood draw. But here we're utilizing functional recommendations for these B vitamins, for alpha lipoic acid, based on the fact that there were oxidative stress indications. Does that all make sense to everyone? Any question on that? I think it's an important concept to think about. And then the next page is a continuation of this. So as we look at page 2, we're looking at the suggested supplement schedule. And it's really just, as I said, a continuation of what we just looked at on the front page. We have the various antioxidants, the B vitamins, the minerals, all that from the front page. But also we have, vitamin D, well, not here, the amino acids laid out. We have here the daily recommended intake, or DRI. So this would be really the United States government minimal standard. In other words, how much vitamin C to prevent scurvy. I don't really spend time on that personally, because it's really there to give you a sense of perspective. But I certainly don't want to just think in terms of, I just want to make sure they get just enough not to get scurvy. What I want to know is, what are the recommendations of the test? And that's what you see here under patient daily recommendations. So these recommendations, still color-coded, green, yellow, red, are what we're recommending based on the algorithm finding for the markers on the test. So you can see, for example, alpha lipoic acid, a high need. And what's our recommendation based on that algorithm report of high need? 200 milligrams. And you can see the green, even though green meant that it was the minimal amount that we would recommend, for vitamin A, it was 3,000 IU. And so that's how you determine the recommendations. They're all listed here. We tend to be conservative, and that's why you may have a patient sitting in front of you, and you might say, Dr. Goldman, I notice you have a high need recommendation for alpha lipoic acid. Having seen this patient, I think they need more than that. That's the purpose of the provider daily recommendations column. This is for the physician, so that they can fill in. You think 300 milligrams makes more sense? Absolutely. Here it is. Just fill it in. That's the idea. So all of these findings are really based on the algorithm, the findings of the algorithm. Now, As far as the amino acids, you can see there are milligrams per day recommendations made here. These are based on the direct measurement of the first morning void amino acids. You have to get past the low 20% of the reference range in order not to have a recommendation. So if you're really low and still in the reference range, you may still get a recommendation. So my guess is, for example, for glutamine at 89 milligrams a day, we'll find that it's in the reference range, but so low in the reference range that we still feel there's a need to supplement. So at this point, the hope is that as a physician, I've looked at this data. I know what the headlines are. I know the B vitamins are a big headline, right? I know a moderate magnesium, some oxidative stress. I have my specific recommendations, and I have a look at recommendations around amino acid support. I would point out that I never start talking about the amino acids based on this. I want to look at the amino acids page because sometimes there's some insights, pattern analysis insights that are really going to help me design my protocol. So I want to look at that before I draw any conclusion. Now, the next section of this test, I think is of great value because running the test and as a physician understanding the test is one thing. Communicating it to your patients effectively is another. And so what I would call a report of findings in my office, I want to sit down with the patient and be able to walk through these findings in a way that they understand. And that's what the interpretation at a glance is all about. So, for example, page 3 is all about antioxidants. So if I look at vitamin A here, here again is my green, yellow, and red configuration. Okay, now the black X tells me where the algorithm placed the patient's functional need for vitamin A. 3,000 IUs is what we put out as our recommendation to be in the green, the lowest supplement recommendation. And then we have these talking points, these color-coded arrows. The green, what is vitamin A? The yellow, how may have I become deficient in it? The gray, what might I see clinically as a result of a deficiency? And then the purple, my favorite, how do I get this from foods? So it's a great way to sit down with the patient and go through all of these findings. Here's your high need for alpha lipoic acid, our 200 milligram recommendation, and those talking points. If you forget what the arrows signify, on the bottom of page 3 is a key. Page 4 is the same thing. Again, you see B1, moderate need in yellow, recommendation 25 milligrams. What is it? How did I get low in it? What might I see clinically? Where do I get this from my diet? Same thing on minerals on page 5 and digestive support. And again, I think it's important to note that we're conservative because you see here in this case, the need for probiotics was very low. So in green, we're saying 10 billion colony forming units. But if it had been very high in red, our recommendation would have been 50 billion colony forming units. There are companies that make probiotics that are like 400,000 colony forming units. So the physician really has to look at this and make that decision. And then we also have this page where we're looking at various factors around mitochondrial dysfunction, toxic exposure, and need for methylation. Again, the algorithm determining that. By the way, another aside, there is a section, if you go on our NutriVal page, as I did for the Metabolomix Plus page, there is an interpretive guide for the NutriVal that has a section on this interpretation at a glance that lists various markers that were considered by the algorithm in coming up with the recommendation. So they can see those markers that were part of this test that we utilized for the low mitochondrial dysfunction finding. So if you're curious about that, that would be in the interp guide for the NutriVal. So that's basically the end of the patient's copy of the report. At that point, they have a copy of the report where they know what the key findings were, what the recommendations, dose recommendations were, and some explanation in the interpretation at a glance as to the meaning and even how to get these nutrients from their food. the next part of this test, beginning on page 7, is a continuation, and it's the physician's copy, because now we're going to look at the data. The first portion of the data is going to be the organic acids from first morning void. So page 7, I'll come back to, because I know everybody's very excited to go over the Krebs cycle. I feel that. But we can go to page 8 first, because page 8 is really the metabolic analysis markers. This is the organic acids first morning void finding, okay? And so we start off with malabsorption and dysbiosis markers, and you see those here. So malabsorption and bacterial dysbiosis markers, yeast fungal dysbiosis markers. Be aware, for these, there's no low end. Here are your reference ranges. So low is fine, you're in the green. That means you're in the reference range. Green and yellow combined are the reference range. Green tends to be a better portion of the reference range, and the red would be elevated outside high to the reference range. Now, just a word about organic acids. Organic acids aren't nutrients. Organic acids are really metabolic intermediaries. So you have all these metabolic pathways running through your body all the time. They typically start off with a nutrient. A nutrient would be something like an amino acid or quercetin, lignins, and these nutrients go through metabolic pathways all through your body, and they're impacted. And as a result, they convert into intermediary metabolites. That's what the organic acids are. They're the intermediary metabolites. And so if you can look at elevations or low findings for these intermediary metabolites, you can get a feeling for what's going on in these pathways. In the case of the malabsorption and dysbiosis markers, these are often acted upon in these pathways by anaerobic bacteria. So that by looking at elevations, we may see that the nutrients, like let's say you have tryptophan, an amino acid, in your diet from eating protein, but you have malabsorption. So the tryptophan lingers in your gut because it's not being readily absorbed in the small gut. Well, that means that it's going to be laying around in the gut longer and being converted by anaerobic bacteria into an organic acid called indoleacetic acid in higher concentration. So when I see a high indoleacetic acid, it may mean that I have some malabsorption of that amino acid. It may mean that I have an imbalance, a dysbiosis of those anaerobic bacteria that are making the conversion. So those are the reasons why these specific organic acids for these specific categories. I would add, and it's in the Interp guide, that there are other possible reasons, dietary reasons, why some of these can be elevated. If you are elevated in 3-hydroxyphenolacetic acid, if you drink a lot of wine or eat grapes a lot, that would elevate that. The benzoic acid here elevated in isolation is also when you have any kind of a drink in a can or a bottle, you'll see sodium or potassium benzoate as a preservative. So those are things to investigate. And there's a listing of all those possibilities in the Interp guide. Now, when we look at the cellular energy and mitochondrial metabolites, these are basically the findings of the Krebs cycle at a glance page. So what you're looking at on that list is really how are the organic acids looking that comprise the Krebs cycle. So what we've done here is we have this diagram, this pathway chart of a Krebs cycle, and then we plug in the various findings from the organic acids where they belong in the chart. We know that, for example, that the mitochondria produce energy through the Krebs cycle, but it begins with macronutrients. What do I mean by macro? Well, proteins as amino acids, carbohydrates through glycolysis, making pyruvic acid and lactic acid, fats as fatty acids oxidizing. They fuel acetyl-CoA production. And then in the mitochondria, acetyl-CoA puts us through the Krebs cycle for the production of energy. And so what we're doing here is we're looking for imbalances. If we see imbalances of the organic acids, there may be certain nutrients that we can provide to help bring better balance here. So as carbohydrates convert to pyruvic acid and lactic acid, you can see this green circle, Mg, magnesium. The green circles are the nutrient cofactors needed to move forward in the pathway. So this would read carbohydrates with adequate magnesium as a cofactor produce pyruvic acid. So if you had a low pyruvic acid, if it was in the red on the left, and you'd say, well, Dr. Goldman, why is that low? Well, it could be that they're on a low carb diet, but it could also indicate a need nutritionally, functionally for magnesium. So those are the kinds of connections that lead to nutrient support. You can sometimes see these red circles, arsenic, mercury, antimony. High concentrations of some of these toxics can also provide a blocking of the pathway. So that's how you use this chart to get a sense of functional recommendations. If fats, as fatty acids, don't oxidize readily to acetyl-CoA, you'll see an elevation in adipic or subearic acid. You would think about carnitine and magnesium. Functional recommendations. So that's how you basically read this chart as you go around the horn here. Okay? So I can always tell when I speak to doctors, when I say, okay, let's go take a look at the Krebs cycle, I either hear a groan or an excited giggle. That's how I can tell the ones that really want to dig into this kind of physiology. But I tend to giggle. So back to the page 8. At the bottom of the page, notice there's this creatinine concentration. That's really important. Whenever you do any urine testing in a lab, you have to have a fixed point in which to ratio things. Usually it's either the volume of the urine or the creatinine concentration. We use the creatinine concentration. So here you see the creatinine concentration well within the reference range, so we have an excellent specimen. And that takes us up to the neurotransmitter metabolites. These are, again, pathways, and I don't know if we really want to get into great detail here, but these are pathways of neurotransmitters where we're, again, looking, as we did in the Krebs cycle, for imbalances. So, for example, there's a pathway in the adrenal medulla that takes the nutrient, tyrosine, an amino acid, and converts it into dopamine. Dopamine gives you a sense of focus. It's why at 6 in the morning you can still listen to me talking about dopamine. Dopamine converts into homovanillic acid. So if this is elevated, you have to wonder, are they metabolizing dopamine at an upregulated pace? It also goes downstream to make norepinephrine, epinephrine, adrenaline, and then finally vinylmandelic and 3-methyl-4-hydroxyphenylglycol. So we're looking for balance in these. And if we see imbalances, we can speak to nutrient cofactor supports. These vitamin markers are B vitamin recommendations, and the principle behind them are that these organic acids need specific B vitamin cofactors in order to be broken down. So that if you see an elevation and they're not broken down, that tells me that the B vitamin is functionally lacking. And if the B vitamin is lacking, that means you're going to have an elevation in the urine. So, for example, in this case, it looks fine, but glutamic acid or FIGLU. FIGLU is an indication of a folate need. And so what happens is, if you don't have if you don't have folate to break down FIGLU, it accumulates in the blood and then gets dumped in the urine. So high concentrations of glutamic acid in the urine would clue the algorithm into a functional need for folate. So again, all of these are listed in the Interp guide so that you can get a sense of which B vitamins are being recognized here as a functional need. The toxin and detoxification markers, alpha ketophenolacetic acid is from styrene, styrofoam. If you're microwaving with plastics, even exhaust fumes, you'll have an elevation of this organic acid. Alpha hydroxyisobutyric acid is from MTBE. MTBE is a gasoline additive that had been utilized in this country, in the US, that was used to lower gasoline emissions. But it's still in the environment, it's in the water. So these are toxics. Orotic acid is a organic acid associated with liver support needs when elevated. And pyroglutamic acid is a precursor and breakdown product of glutathione. So all of these give us insight into toxic exposure and our capacity to address it. The amino acids are on page 9. And what I do here is I look for any kind of pattern. Remember, the nutritionally essential amino acids means that you don't synthesize these. These come from your diet. So when I look at these, I draw an imaginary plumb line right down the center and say, what's the pattern? Here, the pattern is kind of to the left of midline overall. So that tells me that they're low in their amino acids from their diet. So the question it poses for me is, does that mean that they are not digesting and absorbing protein very well? Or does that mean that they are just on a low protein diet? And perhaps it's as simple as eating more protein. And there are clues to the answer to that. So again, we see kind of a lower pattern of essential amino acids. I look at these dietary peptide-related markers to get a sense of the dietary intake of protein. Anserine comes from fish and fowl and meat. It converts into 1-methylhistidine. So this is a very good indicator, 1-methylhistidine, of dietary intake of protein. You see here, it's kind of low. So this, to me, indicates the possibility that the reason why the amino acid pattern is kind of low may be more about a lack of dietary intake. But there are other markers. The carnosine can indicate dietary intake of meat, and that looks moderate. 3-methylhistidine can come from the breakdown of muscle, like if you're going to the gym and working out, or if you're eating a lot of red meat, or if you're catabolic in terms of your muscle breakdown. And then I look at the urea. This level of urea would speak to maybe more of a protein intake. Overall, this looks like something that's kind of on a low, moderate amount of protein. So that is consistent. It may be more about eating more protein, as well as some possible digestive enzyme support. When I look at page 10, these oxidative stress markers, I'm looking for oxidative stress damage that's measurable. When I look at lipid peroxides, here again, the green and yellow combined are the reference range. But sometimes you really want to be in the green. And that's true for lipid peroxides and 8-hydroxydeoxyguanosine, 8-OHDG. Lipid peroxides speak to measurable damage, oxidative stress damage to lipids, like cell membranes. So when we saw that alpha lipoic acid recommendation on the front pages, this is probably a big part of it. The 8-OHDG is a different kind of measured oxidative stress damage. It comes from, in the cell nucleus, free radical activity creating DNA damage. But here it looks just fine. So everything we just looked at really used to be called the optimal nutritional evaluation and is now the metabolomics. The plus is what we go to next, because this is what the algorithm was based on and the recommendations on the front pages. Now, other options here are for the add-on blood spot essential and metabolic fatty acids. As I say, it's very convenient. There's a kit, the little tiny lancet that they just get a little bit of a specimen from their fingertip. It's got a cardboard box with a cardboard card with circles, and you just put the blood spot right in the circle, and the lab takes that and is able to provide omega-3 fatty acids, omega-9 fatty acids, saturated fatty acids, omega-6s, monounsaturated, and look at the delta-6 desaturase and cardiovascular risk. So this is a great add-on and no need for a phlebotomist. Now, when you look at the omega-3s, you think in terms of the possibility of a need, because in an inflammatory patient, you'll often see low omega-3. There is a calculation called the omega-3 index that is in the literature a good way of getting a sense of need for omega-3 support. It's right here at the bottom of the page. Now, what you see here at 9.2 is right in the green. Remember, the yellow and green combined are the reference range. So this index tells me that this patient's doing rather well as far as omega-3. Anything under 4 is going to get my attention, and I would consider that a very pro-inflammatory finding. When we look at the omega-9, you think about olive oil and such, here a little on the lower side. These also have some anti-inflammatory qualities. And then the saturated fatty acids from meat and dairy, coconuts, palm oils, kind of an overall low percentage on this sample report. But you'll see people on like high meat diets very often have a very high percentage of saturated fats, and that's something to discuss around balance. And then the omega-6s. The omega-6s are really I think, very interesting in that people tend to avoid omega-6s because they have a fear of the arachidonic acid being high. And that's true. A high arachidonic acid is a creator of a cascade of inflammation. But people tend to neglect the need for arachidonic acid. So they're always like trying to get it as low as possible. But you need arachidonic acid in terms of cell viscosity, for example. So there's a really nice chart here on page 12 that I often direct physicians to that looks at the omega-6 family. And you can see we start off at the linoleic at 24.4. You see sources, grains, vegetable oils. So right in the heart of the reference range. Through this enzyme of delta-6 desaturase, we go to this gamma, that Y is a gamma linolenic acid, or GLA. A little bit of a drop-off, not bad. And then gamma linolenic, GLA, through a longase enzyme, will convert into DGLA. This is the one that people tend to not notice so much. They're so focused on the arachidonic acid that they don't notice that the DGLA may be low. Now, in this case, the DGLA looks great, but DGLA is a really strong anti-inflammatory. So if you're seeing a low DGLA, you really want to act on that. You can't, at least in this country, get commercially a supplement of DGLA. It comes from the conversion of the GLA into DGLA. So when I look at this, one thing I might consider is trying to increase, if this were low, in this case it looks just fine, but if my DGLA was in the red or very low, I could think of a couple of options. Number one, increasing the GLA. And you see right here, evening primrose, borage, blackcurrant, those are all sources of GLA that a patient can take. By increasing the GLA, more substrate to convert to the DGLA. Another thing to consider is how are the elongase and delta-6 desaturase enzymes working? Are they working well? And so you might look at some of these cofactors, the elongase cofactors, some of these B vitamins, vitamin C, a lot of crossover between delta-6 and elongase. So the strategy here is I want GLA to be available. I want it to convert well to DGLA, and I don't want the arachidonic acid to become elevated. Those are the things to watch for. The next section here involves, again, these are add-ons now, the add-on comprehensive urine elements profile. They include toxic elements, and you can see how many, from lead all the way through uranium. This is the reference range in yellow. The red would indicate above the reference range. And the red TMPL line really speaks to a level. There's a text that we utilize as a resource whereby once they get into the red, based on that textbook, that there's a strong evidence of it having an impact on health. So notice, for example, arsenic is, as soon as you get out of the reference range, it's considered a problem. Some of these not quite as much, but you really don't want to be in the red for these toxics. Again, this is first morning void. When you're looking at first morning void toxicity, you're looking at a very small window of exposure. If I'm talking to you now and I have sushi and I'm eating sushi and I'm suddenly, increasing my levels of mercury, I might excrete that from now until the next few days. So the window of exposure demonstrated in urine is a smaller one, as opposed to, say, if you did a whole blood look at toxics, you're probably looking at 3, maybe up to 4 week window of exposure time, where it would still tag in the blood as an elevation. So when someone says to me, gosh, I noticed that the lead is high. When I was a kid, I was exposed to lead. Is that what this means? I would have to say no. This lead exposure is a more current exposure. And then the nutrient elements are on the right. Again, same thing, but all of these nutrients are taken into account, as well as these: cadmium, magnesium, potassium, and sulfur. Now, you do have the option of, instead of doing the comprehensive means you get the toxic elements and you get the nutrient elements. The toxic elements is just this toxic elements without the nutrients on the right. And there may be a bit of a savings in that doctors want to take advantage of. But this would be the complete comprehensive urine elements profile from urine. Again, ratio to the creatinine. And then finally, the genomics. And I don't know if you've all looked into single nucleotide polymorphisms much. I find them really very, very interesting. Just in a nutshell, what you're looking at with single nucleotide polymorphisms, and forgive this very simplistic metaphor, I find it very useful when I'm talking to patients. Because what's a chromosome? What's a gene? What's the difference? What are we really looking at? I tell patients that a chromosome is like a sweater, a really big, bulky sweater. But I notice that there's a thread sticking out. So I start pulling on that thread, and I'm pulling on that thread. If I look at that thread from that chromosome, from that sweater under the microscope, it would be that double helix, that twisted ladder. Each rung of the ladder comprised of two bases that make up a rung. If I took a scissor and snipped off about 3 inches of that thread, I'm looking at a gene. So when I have that gene in my hand with its double helix and the bases lined up, if there's a change in one of those rungs of the ladder, the nucleotide, if there's a single nucleotide polymorphism, that affects the code. So as that gene is a code for a protein, and that's what enzymes are, proteins, it can have an impact on how an enzyme functions. In some cases, we see from study that a certain SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism, may upregulate an enzyme. In other instances, it may downregulate an enzyme. But that's what we're looking at when we're looking at SNPs. And I think it's important to remember that SNPs are very common. They're prevalent. People have these. And therefore, their penetrance is more limited. A BRCA gene, for example, is a type of mutation that's much more rare, not prevalent. Its clinical implications become much greater. So these, I say, are really just tendencies based on how these SNPs come out to these different enzymes. So I think that's really important. I've had on the phone a doctor asked me, there was this couple, and they both had the COMT SNP, and they wanted to know if they should have kids. And the answer is, yeah, you can have kids. Just make sure that they get good cofactor methylation. But because these are not sentences, they're predispositions. I think it's important to remember that. When we look at apolipoprotein E, we're looking at that in the context of how do you metabolize cholesterol? How do you, what kind of content? What do you put it in? Do you put it in an LDL type capsule? Do you put it in an HDL? LDL is what people call the bad cholesterol, HDL, the good cholesterol. Is there a tendency towards one or the other in terms of risk? So as it says here, apolipoprotein E plays a key role in lipid metabolism, helping remove dietary cholesterol. And so there are 3 different alleles. Each parent gives you an allele. So if you look here, the allele, one parent gave a 2, one parent gave a 4. There's a 2, a 3, and a 4. Those are the options. 3 would be in yellow here because it's by far the most common. In most populations that are studied, 3-3 is the most common, and it poses a moderate risk towards more production of the LDL, more risk-inducing cholesterol. The 2 is in green here because 2 is considered the least risk-inducing around LDL as opposed to HDL. The 4 is in red because it really confers the highest risk of packaging cholesterol in the LDL higher risk form. There have been also a great deal of literature written about the 4 and cognitive issues, especially a 4-4 finding. So this is a 2-4 finding. And by the way, when it comes to these single nucleotide polymorphisms, there's usually more than one side to the story. I just told you that the 2 is in green because in the context of apolipoprotein E, there's more of a tendency toward the production of the HDL, the less risk inducing. But people that have a 2 have a more of a tendency to high triglycerides and a more difficult time in dietary changes of lowering the triglycerides. So we offer a great deal of context here. There are health implications that speak to this. The E2, E4 is rare, less than 3% of a given population. And then it goes through various things that are increased or decreased risk. And then it gets into clinical management considerations in terms of what you might want to do. So for this, restriction of saturated fat and cholesterol lowers total LDL cholesterol and cardiovascular risk, cardiovascular disease most effectively in ApoE4 individuals. So it's all written out there for the physicians to review. These are all add-ons. MTHFR, 5,10-methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase, another enzyme that this one is involved in methylation. Methylation is a detoxification pathway. It's a lot of things, but we think of it a lot in terms of how it detoxifies stuff. For example, estrogen. As you talk about safely detoxifying estrogen, especially on patients that may want to have hormone therapy and increase their estrogen, you want to know that when they break down their estrogen into phase 1 metabolites, 2-hydroxy, 4-hydroxy, 16-alpha, that they also can phase 2 methylate those metabolites safely and excrete them. So if you're not methylating well, you may have a greater risk factor, for example, with higher estrogen levels with hormone therapy. And there are things, nutritional things to do to try to help with methylation. The MTHFR enzyme is very specific in its role as far as methylation. It is really driving the folate cycle in that when you have homocysteine, it needs to, in the cycle, go back and become methionine. That's what you're driving at with that cycle. Well, homocysteine grabs onto a methyl group through the folate cycle. And MTHFR is one of the driving enzymes to allow for that available methyl group, to allow for that methylation cycle to run smoothly. You can see here, the top is homozygous negative. Each parent provided a negative finding, whereas the second finding is homozygous positive. And you see the arrows pointing down. So this is telling me that we have a downregulation of the MTHFR as a result of these polymorphisms. And you can see the health implications indicated in terms of a 30 to 40% reduction in MTHFR enzyme activity. And so that could lead to things like high homocysteine, because homocysteine is counting on MTHFR to give it its folate group, make it available, and risk in terms of ischemic stroke and other listed issues here. And then there's the clinical management considerations in terms of the various B vitamins that you might want to utilize to try to more upregulate the action of MTHFR. Another methylation enzyme here is COMT. Now, COMT, catechol methyltransferase, is the specific enzyme that methylates phase 1 estrogen metabolites into methylated metabolites that become polar and get excreted more readily. That's what you're doing there. COMT, catechol methyltransferase, has a methyl group. It conjugates it. It slaps it onto a phase 1 metabolite, like 2-hydroxyestrogen or 4-hydroxyestrogen, to make 2-methoxyestrogen, 4-methoxyestrogen, so that it can be polar and excreted. And so that's a key a role of COMT enzyme. COMT enzyme also methylates catecholamines like dopamine that we talked about earlier, and adrenaline and serotonin. So if you have a patient that has a lot of anxiety, you may be dealing with someone that has a problem with this enzyme, Because if they're not able to use COMT to conjugate, to take that methyl group and put it on adrenaline so that it can get excreted, you might start stockpiling adrenaline, and that's going to cause an anxious reaction. Okay, so that's why these are so important. And in this case, we have a heterozygous finding. One parent, a positive allele, one parent, a negative allele. See that here on the left. Here's your SNP, and it's pointing down. So it's a down regulation of the COMT enzyme. And so you see the various health implications. You see the various clinical considerations, which are similar to MTHFR because they're both very much involved in the methylation pathway. Okay? This is just such an ongoing study, and it's fascinating to me. And I think that clinicians really are digging into this to try to understand how they can nutritionally affect their patient's health. And again, I know I'm full of metaphors. You're probably still reeling from the chromosome as a sweater metaphor. Here's another one. What we're doing here, it's like if I decide to go buy a racehorse, that's going to be my enzyme in this scenario. And I find out that genetically that the racehorse that I bought is just never going to likely be the fastest horse on the track. My enzyme may be downregulated. What do? Well, what I do is I give it the best nutrition I can. I get it a trainer. I get it exercise so I can get the most out of that horse in terms of its speed on the track. And that's kind of the purpose behind looking at these SNPs. You can see up or down regulated enzymes with possible potential clinical manifestations. So what do I do? Why do I bother even knowing that? Well, because there are things that I can do nutritionally, exercise-wise, environmentally, to try to up the performance of that enzyme for optimal health for my patient. And that's what makes this study so exciting, because it does provide you with that actionable intervention nutritionally, for example. Our last SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism, as an add-on here, is the Tnf alpha, tumor necrosis factor alpha. Now, this is a cytokine. Cytokines are a type of protein. You hear the term cytokine storm, for example, a lot. Cytokines, for the most part, not all, is interleukin-10, which is an anti-inflammatory cytokine, but for the most part, cytokines are proteins that are very pro-inflammatory. So a greater presence of an inflammatory cytokine means that a patient has much more of a tendency towards inflammatory responses. I heard a very well-regarded physician, and rightfully so, describe TNF alpha as the Frankenstein monster of inflammation, that it's a very strongly pro-inflammatory cytokine. So you don't want higher production of this. When we look at this tumor necrosis factor alpha for inflammation, in this case, we're homozygous negative, which, by the way, you'll hear the term sometimes wild type with homozygous negative. And so that's a good finding, because that means a decreased production of TNF alpha. That's what you want to see. A positive allele, heterozygous, or a homozygous positive, plus, would really ratchet up the tendency for a patient to be very inflamed. And so again, you see the health implications and clinical considerations. And by the way, these things, the text on these SNPs does vary with the findings. So, this is not a static a text. This text that we're looking at right now in the sample report is based on this wild type homozygous negative finding. If there was a plus negative, heterozygous, plus, homozygous positive, very high inflammation, that would certainly be reflected in the text on this text. So I have now, some of you ungodly hour in the morning, some later, gone through the full Metabolomix Plus, which again, the Metabolomix Plus without any of the add-ons, first morning void organic acids, first morning void amino acids, ox stress markers, 8-OHDG, and lipid peroxides, and then the add-on options, the essential metabolic fatty acids from just a little lancet of blood spots, great amount of information there, especially around inflammation as well. And then the option of a comprehensive urine elements profile or just the toxic elements profile, which would just be this left side. Remember, urine is a more immediate finding in terms of exposure. And then, of course, the genomics, the ApoE and the methylating MTHFR and COMT, as well as the very pro-inflammatory TNF alpha cytokine SNP. So, Kimberly, that's the test in a nutshell. If there are questions, I'm happy to hear them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldman. We appreciate your time. Does anyone on the call have anything that they want to ask clinical relevance for Dr. Goldman while we still have him?
Yes, I would like to ask a question about the bit where we're talking about malabsorption and dysbiosis markers, and in the interpretation at a glance, the digestive support. So I'm guessing that the need for probiotics and pancreatic enzymes, the markers that this refers to are the malabsorption and dysbiosis markers. But I'm just wondering, like probiotics in general, like we might have pracs who ask, well, what kind of bacteria, what strains, so forth, like, is there any kind of more, like, can you just talk a little bit more about the dysbiosis and probiotic stuff? That would be great.
Yeah, sure. Now, it's a good question, especially around this section, because when you're looking at malabsorption and dysbiosis markers through organic acid elevation, and you're correct, for the most part, the recommendations around the probiotics come from this section that I have up here. Because, as I said earlier, elevations of these organic acids can speak to an imbalance of the conversion of the nutrient, like an amino acid, into an organic acid, or malabsorption of the nutrient, allowing it to linger longer and thus be more prone to being converted into the organic acid. And the truth of the matter is that this is only giving us a sense of the possibility of dysbiosis and the need for probiotics. So it's not looking at the actual finding of a low lactobacillus or bifidobacterium or E. coli. It's really an extrapolation based on these metabolic pathways and how they behave. And for that reason, this isn't going to give you, you need this much lactobacillus as opposed to you need this much bifido. I know in the US, most of the probiotics are going to be predominantly bifidobacterium and lactobacillus. If you want to really get a much closer look, a gold standard for what you're asking for, I would highly recommend the GI Effects 2200 comprehensive test, because here, using organic acid levels and knowing the pathways, we're extrapolating a functional need. On a stool analysis, you are actually seeing what the numbers are. Through DNA, you're actually getting a head count of lactobacillus, of bifidobacterium, of E. coli. You're actually getting a culture to see how, you know, with DNA, you're getting a number, a quantitative read. With culture, you're getting a sense of how robust they are. Do they grow out? Are they strong and resilient? What specific bacteria or yeast that grow out that may be potentially pathogenic or pathogenic? You are specifically getting an eyeball look at what they are. And that's where you're going to have a much more specific design as to your protocol. From this test, I would say, based on the clinical presentation and the findings, I might just say, okay, there's a need here for probiotics. I'm going to give probiotics in a good balance. There may be a need for pancreatic enzyme support, also based on this and what we discussed on the amino acid levels. Do I see low amino acids with high protein intake? Digestive enzymes, maybe pancreatic enzymes, maybe betaine HCl. But in the GI, as far as probiotics, your best bet to really know specifics, because it's an actual witnessing of the presence of these things and a measurement of these things, would be a stool analysis with both culture and DNA.
Yes. Okay. That clears it up. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's a great question. Does anybody else have a question?
Yes, I do. First of all, thank you for your presentation. And my question is just about the reference range and also the recommendations that you do on the report. Are those values the same for gender and also age? And also in regards to age, do you also recommend this test for a pediatric age, or from, is there any specific recommendations on that as well? And thank you.
Yeah, again. There are, and we can get those, Kimberly, out to them in an email if you want. But there are distinctions. There's a reference range population that are used for these individually, and there are differences in the recommendations based on age and some on sex, as my recollection of it. And I believe we can get you that information. So, very often what you're going to see in this test is that there'll be a recommendation based on the findings, and the algorithm will determine, is it a low need? Is it a moderate need? Is it a high need? And then the reference range itself, based on text that we utilize and literature that we utilize, well, what's a moderate need for somebody at a certain age cutoff point or sex? And so I don't, off the top of my head, have them all in my recollection, but we can certainly find that out for you. But there will be variations based on, I know, certainly age, and I think in some instances sex.
Thank you.
And Kimberly, feel free to remind us to get that out there.
Okay, I will. Thanks, Dr. Goldman. Does anyone else have any questions? No? Okay, well, thank you guys so much for joining in. I know that as sales reps, you come across various questions from your practitioners that maybe you didn't think about in this training. So as that occurs, please feel free to email me directly or email Lars, and he'll send the email to me. I'm a sales rep as well, so I'm here to help you from that angle. And if you guys come across competition in the field, maybe a doctor's using a different company, and you want to know why the Metabolomix is better than, Great Plains or SpectraCell or some other nutritional type panel, I can absolutely help you with that information as well. So I'm here to support you. I want you to be successful out there. This is a great test. And best of all, as Dr. Goldman said, it can be done completely from the patient's home, which in times of global pandemics is very useful. And it's kind of customizable, right? If the doctor is interested in essential metabolic fatty acids or omegas, they can add that on. If a patient has a history of toxic exposure, they can add on toxins in the urine. If the doctor is concerned about their, genetic predispositions and their SNPs, we have 4 different ones. You can add on 1 or all 4. So it's a great panel with a lot of useful clinical information. So we're excited about it, and I'm here to support you guys as you get out there in the field. Shayna, when will you have access to the test in VMS? I don't know what VMS is, but I'm thinking that's an internal system, maybe.
Yes, that's our system.
Okay.
So yeah, so we will look into
I
that.
just made you the presenter, by the way, so you have control.
Thanks, Dr. Goldman. Great, and you guys, we do have marketing materials as well. What you see up on the screen is like our sales sheet with sort of pictures of what the sample report would look like, and then just an explanation on the front. And I actually put together some things, but we're running a little bit out of time. So I want to thank Dr. Goldman for his time. And Dr. Goldman, please feel free to jump off. I know you have other client calls today and helping assist with medical consultation. So thank you.
Oh, it was a great pleasure. And please, as questions come up, do let us know. We're always here to provide information. We're never going to give somebody a test and say, okay, you're on your own. We want the questions. We want to be helpful to you. So thanks again for being here. I know for some of you, a ridiculous hour of the day. So thank you very much. I do appreciate you. And everybody be safe. Talk to you later.
Thanks, Dr.
Thank
Goldman.
you.
Well, you guys, I know you might have questions about pricing, and I've discussed that with Lars, but I don't know how much you guys mark up different things. So, Lars, if you have questions that you need to send to me, let me know. Yeah, otherwise we can get you guys some sample reports or some sales sheets or some various collateral to be helpful. And if you guys aren't aware, we have a podcast. It's called the Lab Report. So if any of you have an iPhone and you go into the podcast app, it's the little like purple icon on your iPhone. It says podcasts. And if you search the Lab Report, you'll see the Genova Diagnostics podcast. And they're short little podcasts, and they just did one on the Metabolomix, this test. So that could be a helpful little refresher. And the doctors at Genova who lead the podcast are really funny. It's Dr. Patty Goldman and Dr. Michael Chapman, and they are good friends, and they have a funny kind of dynamic together. And so it's an entertaining podcast, and they have different guests on that are always really impressive. So check that out as well. There's tons of resources. And again, I'm here to help support you so you can be successful when you're up against doctors and competitors and other sales reps. So just let me know. And I've recorded this whole session, so I can pass this along to anyone, Lars, who wasn't able to make it today.
Yeah, that would be great. Did you send me the price for the Metabolomix?
I
test?
did. I sent it to you in WhatsApp.
Okay.
But I also can, if you want me to show you now, I can do that too. You let me know.
No, that's fine. I'll just find it. So,
Yeah.
Then I will do the calculation, guys, and it will be uploaded into VMS, and I will send you an email when the price and product is uploaded into VMS.
Okay, great.
Good.
Well, thank you guys so much. It was nice to see all of you guys this morning. And again, if you guys don't already have my email here, I'll put it in the chat box right now. But it's just, my name's Kimberly, so it's my first initial, K, and then my last name, Weeth, at GDX for Genova Diagnostics.net. So any questions, send them to me, and if I don't know the answer, I will find out from Dr. Goldman for you. All right. Well, great. I think a lot of you are wrapping up your workday, so have a wonderful Friday tomorrow. I'm just starting mine.
Yeah, a happy 4th of July break.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Lars. I'll maybe talk to you in a little bit. Otherwise, I'll just be messaging you throughout the day, probably.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, perfect.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.